Welcome back. Just to sort of round off that discussion for the moment, I'm going to make a reference to a book that, well, I had in my undergrad years from the Studies in Society series, Social Perspectives from Alan Unwin, Religion in Australia, Social Perspectives. Again, it's one of those older books from 1991, but it's one of the few places where I found some interesting material that's been written on Anzac Day as a civil religion. I find it primarily in the introduction written by Alan Black to this book, where he notes that most of our Anzac Day rituals are focused upon, as he says, the symbolism attached to the main war memorials, the cenotaphs in the major Australian cities, and the little war memorials with the statue of the unknown soldier in every little town and major regional city, at which we have marches and dawn services, etc. And he remarks that most of this symbolism draws its sources from classical Greece, rather than from Christian sources. And I read from his book. This attributes partly to the somewhat negative attitude held towards ecclesiastical religion by many Australian troops in World War I in particular, partly to classical Greece as being the supposed source of democracy and of the ideals of freedom for which so many had sacrificed their lives, and partly to the general constraints which emerge in religiously pluralistic societies where there is no formally established religion. In some sense, the Anzac cult, if I can call it that, has moved to fill, I guess, the vacuum left by the demise of organised religions, and also to fill the vacuum that's always been there, because we've never had an established religion in Australia. He goes on to note that while indeed some of the strongest symbols, for instance, in the dawn service, the rising sun, which is a clear sort of reference to resurrection, life after death, do draw some of its meaning from Christian analogues. In a very important way, the Anzac cult subverts or inverts Christian symbolism to create indeed a new religion that in some sense is more centred on values of mateship, of egalitarianism, etc., but also on individuality. So that, and I quote from him again, from this perspective, the drinking in particular that happens in the pubs late on Anzac Day is not simply an expression of mateship or sociability, same can be said of the marches at midday, nor just a way of drowning one's sorrows, but also an assertion of the individual autonomy and personal power, putative means by which both the individual and the nation can be renewed and regenerated. And this is done very much in remembering and reenacting that story of the Anzacs, the Anzac standing as the perfect Australian, the bronzed Aussie who would stand up for his mates, who would endure all things. Stories such as these, and indeed I would argue the Gospels themselves, are sacred stories, or we commonly call them myths. Now, I'm not using myth here in the sense of something that's fundamentally untrue. I'm using myth here in the technical sense of a sacred story, a foundational story. The word myth comes from the Greek mythos, which refers to a veiling, so it tends to veil reality, but not in the sense that it hides it, but rather myth is a metaphorical appreciation of reality. The point being here, of course, that the phenomenal world that's experienced through our senses is a world of things and objects and people, but there's no inherent meaning in those. Where we derive our meaning and our understanding of the purpose of our life come from more esoteric things which are not immediately available to sense experience. And so we tend to tell stories, we develop myths that enable us to order, to make sense of, and to integrate that experience, to try and get at that esoteric element of our experience, which is, what is the meaning, what is the purpose of this? So myths inform us, they inform us about what the really real is. Is what we observe real? Well, yes, it is on one level, but in some sense the question of its significance or its meaning for us is what's really real. And so myths can help us understand what's really real about our sense experience. But it also forms and educates, because myths that have emerged as those that have been embraced by societies, by nations, by groups, ethnic groups, religious groups, that have stood the test of time because they continue to draw forth strong emotions, they continue to speak to the experience of those communities, are used to pass on that understanding, that worldview, that map of relationships that determines how we see the world from one generation to the next. So you noticed in that clip on Anzac Day the importance of telling the next generation the stories of the Anzacs. It's that passing on. So a myth forms and educates. So think about how the Passover ritual and the Anzac rituals both form and educate the communities. As Jews, as Australians, how are those two things used to form and educate? And then take the next step and think, how do the Gospels form and educate the Christian community? Both the original community who heard the stories, but also the communities today. It might be worth pausing this video and having a bit of a think about that and jotting down a few notes. Okay, welcome back. Let's move on. So with that in mind, think about this particular piece, Luke 9 to 19, Luke 9:51 to 19:27. It's the central section of Luke's Gospel, commonly called the travel narrative. It's framed by the ministry in Galilee and the ministry in Jerusalem. It's framed by the story of the Transfiguration and by the triumphal entry into Jerusalem at the other end. In terms of structure, Luke has simply followed Mark here. Matthew does something similar. But what Mark does in 2 chapters, during Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, Luke does in 10. And as we saw last week, it's primarily in this central 10 chapters that we find the bulk of the material that's unique to Luke. Now, unlike Mark, and to a lesser extent Matthew, the way in which this teaching material, and that's what it is, primarily teaching material, it's the same in Mark, it's primarily where Jesus is teaching and instructing his disciples. The structure and style is very dialogical, it's very conversational, where Jesus is putting cases to his disciples and debating with them about possible outcomes. So he's instructing his disciples. The locale, if you like, is Samaria, so it's the land between Galilee and Jerusalem. Jesus is travelling through Samaria. And the teaching, when we look at it, is on one level preparing his disciples for what's going to happen in Jerusalem. He's going to die and be raised. Jesus is going to die and be raised. But it's also preparing them for life after the death, the resurrection and the ascension. It's about life as an ecclesia, as a church, as a community awaiting the parousia. And this, of course, is the very Sitz im Leben, as we call it in German, the situation in life of the community to which Luke is writing. They are a community late in the 1st century who are no longer expecting the parousia to happen tomorrow, but are waiting in hope. And so, like the Passover, like the Anzacs, there is a past, present and future dimension to this experience. And it's very much the case with this teaching material we find in these 10 chapters in Luke. There's no clear itinerary or chronology. Another author that I read some years ago, Eugene Patterson, wrote a really good book called The Word Made Flesh, where he makes the point that, and it's primarily focused on these 10 chapters of Luke. It's more a book of spirituality. In fact, it's spiritual theology as it's called. But there's some very interesting biblical observations here as well. He points out that there's no clear itinerary or chronology. So this is a sort of in-between time. And he compares it to the in-between days that we all experience from Sunday to Sunday when we're not in church. And we spend our time primarily with people who are not members of our community and who may not even be believers. And this is very similar to the experience that Jesus and his disciples are having as they're travelling through Samaria. They're actually encountering people who are not Jews, or at least are partially Jewish. As we know, the Samaritans were not accepted as Jews by either Judeans or Galileans. And even their practices were somewhat syncretistic, so that experience is analogous to something that even modern day Christians have. But from a structural point of view, from a literary point of view, from a sociological point of view, this is what we call a liminal space. It's an in-between time between the structures of the Galilean ministry and the structures of the Jerusalem. It's a very ill-formed area, and this too speaks very strongly to a community awaiting the return of Christ in a new environment, where they have to come to terms with situations, with people that they've never encountered before. They have to apply what they learnt to new situations. So there's central sections about that. So again, it takes us back to the functions of myth, in this case, the functions of the Gospels, to both form and to educate, to help people in the formation of their faith and to educate them about how they are to use their faith in their day-to-day living. So Luke, like Mark, I think is a hero myth. Indeed, Joseph Campbell, the great anthropologist who spent his entire, I think, working life looking at the whole issue of mythology, talked about the hero story or the hero myth as being the only story. In his famous book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, he argued that all the great stories that have survived the test of time, all the great sacred stories are ultimately hero stories. They're stories about great heroes of old. And we talked a bit about this in the introduction to the Bible, and I want you just to remind you of those things as we come to look at the role of the Gospels within the life and the worship life of communities. Now, hero story is basically a continuous narrative, and that's what we've got in the Gospels, about the life and work of an heroic, or in some cases, a mythological person or group of persons that become, if you like, models of ideal behaviour. So, along with Jesus, we would think of things like the stories of the patriarchs in Genesis 12 to 50, the story of Moses, the role that Moses plays in the Passover, for instance. In the wider Greco-Roman world, you've got Hercules and Dionysus and Mithras. In our own tradition, in our English tradition, our British tradition, you've got the Arthurian legends, and of course in the Australian tradition, we've got the Anzacs. We've just been talking about that. The stories of the heroes, particularly in religious circles, form models for prayer and for spirituality. In all circles, though, they form models of good, moral, just behaviour. How might a genuine person live heroically? By following the example of the heroes of old, the Anzacs, or King Arthur, or Moses, or the patriarchs, or Jesus. So, hero myths are very archetypal, okay? Psychologically, because they're about looking at them as models for good behaviour. And it might be worth you thinking, just taking a moment now to think about who's a hero for you. Do you actually pattern your life on someone or a particular heroic type? Where do you draw your values from? Certainly probably from your parents and from your own observation and your own reflection and experience. But usually there is some life-orienting story. There's another good book running around I read a couple of years ago by David Holly called Meaning and Mystery, What It Means to Believe in God. And he talks about the importance of life-orienting stories. And he says all of us in some way have a life-orienting story or a group of stories. And for those of us who are have faith in a particular religious denomination, often those stories are drawn from our faith tradition. And these life-orienting stories, which is probably just another way of talking about myths or meta-narratives, which is another word I prefer, or foundational stories, help order our lives, make sense of it, bring meaning and purpose to our lives. But of course, myths, stories, hero stories, also function socially and culturally. There are stories that are shared by us all. The Anzac legends that we share as Australians, the Arthurian legends we share as people of the English-speaking world, the stories of Moses, the patriarchs and Jesus that we share as Jews and Christians and Muslims. These stories continue to speak to generation after generation because they touch upon the elements of our belief system, those things that we believe to be ultimate, if you like, those things that underpin reality, the really real. But of course, hero stories are also about the quest for maturity, the quest for individuality, the quest for identity. Now, Joseph Campbell talked about there being 4 functions of myth: a cosmological function, that there's the big picture stuff. What's the world all about? What's the structures of the universe, etc.? The sociological, what's that mean for my community? Where do I fit within my nation, within my family, within my location, within my religious affiliation, etc.? Pedagogical, it's about passing on the values and principles to successive generations. Psychological, what does it mean for me? I reflect upon these stories, either consciously and overtly and explicitly, or sometimes it's unconscious, it's already part of us. Eric Byrne guy who wrote the book I'm Okay, You're Okay many years ago, he put forward the theory that all of us adopt a story from our childhood as a sort of life script. Now, I don't think he has a lot of parlance in today's psychological circles, but I've always been intrigued by that notion that we're told stories as a child, and we often adopt a story, mostly unconsciously, that becomes our life script. So the person who's always waiting to be saved, the person who puts in the lotto ticket every week with the dream of winning the lotto and their life will change, is really living out the whole story of Cinderella, waiting for the fairy godmother to come and give them what they want. The person who is eternally young, who is always trying to stay young, trying to live their lives in young ways, tries to mix with young people, are often living out the story of Peter Pan. There are a whole lot of stories that societies tend to rehearse over and over. Mothers and fathers tell their children. And Eric Berne suggested that one of these we tend to adopt as our life story. As I say, I don't think he has a lot of credence in modern psychological circles, but I think there's still some truth to that. I think we build our lives on story, and we build our communities on story as well. And often these are hero stories. And of course, the hero story has a certain cycle, has a certain structure. Talked about that in Introduction to the Bible. Go back and have a look at your notes when we're looking at Mark's Gospel and the structure of Mark's Gospel from that unit. Hero stories about the quest for that independence, for that individual identity, for individuality, for meaning, for truth, or whatever is considered ultimate, to use Frederick Streng's terminology, in one's life or the life of the community. That is, that which provides meaning and purpose. We tell stories, we participate in rituals, sometimes explicit and designed rituals, sometimes rituals that have just emerged and evolved out of our life experience. And these two go hand in hand. Story and ritual always go hand in hand. And so I guess that brings us back to the Gospels. The Gospels are myths or foundational stories or meta-narratives on the one level in terms of their structure. So go back and have a look at your notes from THBS 100 when we talked about Mark as being structured according to the hero cycle, and I think that's true of Luke and Matthew as well, primarily because they take over Mark's structure. And we've just looked at the whole central section of Luke, which, like Mark, is the central section of Mark, so everything leads up to it in a chiastic structure and away from it, and that becomes the key to interpreting the whole of the Gospel. It's all about those instructions to the disciples, which is about how you live in the in-between times. So I think the structure is that of traditional stories, hero stories, but also in terms of its purpose and use. Now, these stories are used as part of liturgy, they're used as part of ritual, and they're used as part of our reflection and our prayer as we try to conform our lives to our faith experience. So they are foundational stories. Now, some scholars, of course, are a bit careful about using the word myth, and rightly so. On the one level, because the word myth has been somewhat degraded to mean something which is untrue, but also René Girard and those who follow Girard, the Girardians as we call them, would argue that when we talk about myths, we should distinguish between pagan myths, which primarily reflect on the futility of human existence, upon fate, and most particularly upon violence. René Girard has made the point that most pagan myths are about violence. The death of the people of old, the heroes of old, often grew out of an attempt to justify violence, which is sanctioned by the group or the state. Because I'm very much aware of the fact that I'm preparing this lecture in the shadow of the death of 8 people or 7 people in Indonesia in the last 2 days in a form of state-sanctioned violence. Indeed, René Girard would argue that most of the myths that we tell each other actually justify violence. An obvious example of this would be to go back to the Anzacs, but I'm not saying that the Anzac story justifies violence, but in some way it continues to be used to justify our role in violent actions in wars around the world. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be involved in that. I'm not going to get into the whole debate about just war or if there is a just war, but I just want to suggest that Anzacs are a good example of the way in which a story, a myth, indeed here, like those that René Girard is talking about, can be used within the context of violence. It's probably not by accident that many of the great hero stories are about tragic heroes, heroes who have died. But René Girard makes the point that if, however, we look at, say, the story of Jesus in the Gospels, in some ways it subverts the common myth. It is not a matter of scapegoating someone for doing the wrong thing or for justifying our forms of legal punishment on those who break the law, but in a very real sense, God becomes the scapegoat and in fact pulls the rug out from any of our justifications and rationalisations around why we commit violence, particularly against minority groups or whatever. So he raises some very interesting questions about, are the Gospels truly mythical? And in this slide, you'll see there's a link to a short article that he wrote back in 1996. Now, he's written several books and a number of articles, but for the purpose of this week's lecture, because I don't want to get sidetracked into Girardian memetics, that's a whole other area we could go into, but it is worth having a look. So by all means, click on that link and have a read of that short article. More importantly, though, I'd like you to look at the Farkas Falvey article, if you haven't already done so, the Eucharistic Provenance of the Christian Bible from his inspiration and interpretation. In this article, the author, I think, puts forward a rather interesting theory about the structure and the use of the Gospels, or biblical stories more generally, but the use of the Gospels within Christian worship, within Christian liturgy. In fact, he puts forward the theory, I think, and quite rightly, that the Gospel stories, the letters of Paul, the book of Revelation, have actually evolved out of the worship life of the community, that indeed ritual and word have grown up together. Indeed, as I mentioned earlier, one of the big questions in anthropology and sociology around ritual and story, around ritual and myth, is which came first. Some things I don't think that that's a very live issue. I don't know whether you can say one came before the other. Nevertheless, in place of the lecture, as well as listening to me, I suggest that particularly you read that article on the Eucharistic Provenance of the Christian Bible. I think it'll get you thinking about your third piece of assessment. If you have time, also have a look at René Girard's Are the Gospels Mythical? Okay, just to conclude, a couple of thoughts. Humans are, as the old saying goes, social animals. All societies are held together by creating a collective identity. And so social cohesion and identity are maintained always by story and ritual. This can be explicit or it can simply be implicit. It can be something that's consciously done or it can be something that simply evolves. And the Anzac Day ceremonies that we've just gone through is a classic example of the way a new religious understanding of who we are as a nation has merged with symbols drawn from ancient Greece, symbols drawn from Christianity, and has created a new, very live, almost civil religion with its own rituals and its own story. And I think that provides a very current and contemporary model for us to imagine how it happened in early Christianity, that the Gospels emerged out of what was happening in these Christian communities, particularly as they parted ways with Judaism. And they had to reform and reshape and reconceptualise the way in which they prayed as a community, the way in which they worshipped Jesus as God. They were embarking on something very new, something very innovative, and yet they had some templates to work with from their Jewish faith. And so they evolved what they had. They drew on the symbolism and the language and even probably the hymns, the psalms, the prophets, etc. that they already had, and they began to create their own stories and their own rituals. And the Gospels function as these foundational stories for these rituals. They are integral to all Christian ritual, even today, albeit because of reforms that come about as a result of Vatican II for the Catholic Church anyway. There is not one ritual, one sacrament, one sacred action that we do that there's not some form of the liturgy of the word. We always read from Scripture. When I was learning liturgy back in the late 70s at the seminary here in Banyo, we had a liturgist, Father Barry Copley, who always had a very pithy saying when he talked about liturgy that I always remembered. He said, I was talking about liturgy of the Eucharist in particular, he said, there are three things that we do. We gather the people, we tell the story, we break bread. And he said those three actions are very ordinary actions that we can find anywhere in the wider community. So go to your local birthday party, go to a Christmas dinner, go to, Anzac Day celebrations, particularly in the informal ones that happen in the pubs where they play two-up. These things happen. We gather together as a family, as comrades in arms, as veterans, and we tell stories about our mates, our past, our shared experiences, and we usually have a meal. We do those three things. But in the Eucharist, we take those three very ordinary actions and we make them extraordinary by underpinning them with reference to the ultimate, to God, to the sacred realm or whatever. And so we gather as a people of the body of Christ. We tell our stories. We read from the scriptures and we break bread. Very ordinary things which become extraordinary. And I'll leave you with this last question, which we'll discuss next week. What came first, the story or the ritual? Thanks for listening to this. I recommend that you, if you haven't already done so, please go back and do the 3 or 4 readings that I've asked you to do and think about how all of this applies to the emergence of the Gospels within early Christian communities. See you next week.